SoundCartel.
In this episode, we're talking to Dan Blank, writer, director and creator of the hit podcast Carrier. Dan and his production team created an amazingly immersive listening experience, and we're going to find out how they did it and why you might like to consider an immersive podcast for your audience.
When you're working in something like animation or film, the motto is always show, don't tell. But with audio, I'm always trying to find ways to allow sound design to tell a story before relying on the dialogue. That was my approach.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 9 of season 4. And hello again to producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hi Nick, so good to be back. Look, this is going to be a fascinating episode with Dan because we're all obsessed with sound here at SoundCartel, which you'd hope for given we work at an audio agency. So we thought that for ourselves and for you, the listener, it would be a great treat to dig into the technology behind binaural audio.
Yes, and not just binaural, but all things immersive, which is something we've been keeping an eye on for a very long time here at SoundCartel. So we know the power it can have on the listener and the depth it can give to the listening experience.
Yeah, especially because sound is something that can be taken for granted. It's not often given a second thought, really. But there are so many aspects to sound, the way it's created and edited.
And the emotion it can bring to the listener as well.
Yeah.
So we know that technology is developing all the time, which is really exciting. And here at SoundCartel, we're experimenting with immersive audio ourselves. And I very much look forward to injecting some new elements into the work that we do with clients. But let's get to Dan Blank and his first-hand experience in this space.
Yes, absolutely. So Dan Blank is a writer-director who's worked in Hollywood for many years. He's directed award-winning short films, commercials, he's written and developed features as well. He dabbles in visual effects and animation and is very much about innovating in the space, which is probably why Dan's first foray into podcasts was this amazing immersive production. Carrier was also nominated for iHeartRadio's Best Fiction Podcast in 2020, which is not bad for your first podcast.
No, not at all.
So let's get straight to the man himself. Dan Blank, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on Podcasting Essentials.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Dan, Carrier did come out last year, but from us to you, congrats again on the success of Carrier.
Thank you. We actually celebrated our 1-year anniversary just last week. So the show officially launched on July 15th last year.
There you go.
So it's been a nice little ride.
Very timely. Yeah, beautiful. Now, Dan, how did the idea for Carrier come about?
Well, I have a background as a filmmaker, and I'd been pitching and developing film projects at studios in Hollywood for many years. And I was becoming frustrated at just how hard it was to get a movie made. There's so many factors that go into greenlighting a production that are out of your control. And I'm someone who came up working in animation and visual effects, producing my own shorts in my spare time. So I was really eager to just get out there and make something again. And I really wanted to find a project that I could make outside the traditional system. So I was thinking a lot about contained worlds and contained stories that could have a very limited cast and few locations, but premise that was compelling enough to keep an audience engaged. So for years, I'd been kicking around this idea of a truck driver transporting a mysterious cargo on an all-night drive. And once I found the right character to drive that truck, who would face the most obstacles and have the most interesting journey, the basic story quickly fell into place. So the story is about a woman named Raylene Watts, who is African-American. She's played by Cynthia Erivo, and she's just trying to get home to her family in Chicago, and she's the one who takes the drive.
And then it goes completely crazy from there, doesn't it? But we don't want to spoil the storyline, Dan, so we'll leave that to the listeners. But being a filmmaker, I guess, congratulations on also selling the film rights now. Was this always the intention when you wrote it? And when will it be in production?
I'd say selling the film rights was a hope, but it was never the sole intention. I should probably back up and just explain how this became an audio drama, even though I'd started developing it as a film. I had wanted to make this thing on a real shoestring budget as an independent project. And just as I was developing it and getting ready to write the screenplay, my agent Rob Herding called me to tell me he was no longer my agent. But it was because he was launching a new company to produce audio dramas. So this project seemed like it was the perfect one to collaborate on and produce through Q-Code. Q-Code has gone on to make some other audio dramas such as Blackout and Left Right Game and quite a few others. So for me, what was so exciting about entering this audio space with Q-Code was that we knew that we'd have a budget to produce the project and a guaranteed distribution model, which meant everything to me. Because one of the challenges, as I've said, of filmmaking is that so many pieces have to come together just the right way in order to get a film into production. But with podcasting, there's no obstacles aside from the ones we were putting on ourselves. And I knew that it was possible to translate something like an audio series into other formats, and it's one of the reasons why Q-Code was founded. And I'm also close friends with someone named Michael Bloomberg, who is one of the co-creators of Homecoming, which is another successful podcast that became a successful television series on Amazon. So I saw how the model could be viable. We launched Carrier, and we had interest from a few production companies and studios. And ultimately, we found our perfect home at Amblin, which is Steven Spielberg's production company. So I've just written the first draft. I'm about to start refining it. And yeah, I'm still very busy on this Carrier story. And there's no guarantee whether we're going to reach production soon, especially under our current circumstances. But so far, everything's been looking really promising.
Yeah, well, good luck. We look forward to seeing it.
Amazing story.
Yeah, me too.
Dan, as you mentioned, your background is predominantly in visual media. Do you have a preference between visual and audio storytelling?
Yeah, I'd say I can't really say I love one more than the other, but I do really love the intimacy of audio storytelling, because both are very collaborative media, but there's something that allows for a very personal engagement with your audience. I think in part because it requires the listener to actively participate in imagining the story that they can't see.
Now, you use binaural recordings, which might be a term that our listeners haven't heard before, and use that to create the immersive listening experience. But before we get into what binaural is, the concept of immersive audio isn't new at all. In fact, at the ABC's AusPod conference here last year, where you were the keynote speaker, you mentioned that it has a history dating back to Paris in the 1890s.
That's right. One of the earliest examples of immersive audio was developed by Clément Ader. It was called the théâtrophone. And it was essentially two telephone lines with two paddles, one for each ear. And the system was hardwired all the way to the Paris Opera House. And on the stage, there were 80 transmitters placed around the stage, capturing the performance from every angle. So the audio quality wasn't great, but this was the world's first live stereo broadcast. And as listeners were able to visualize the distance and the position of the performers, it was the beginning of immersive audio.
It's quite incredible. And then, more than 100 years later, we're sort of going back into that higher production and immersive audio again, which is fantastic. Now, I want to talk specifically about binaural audio, but before I ask you to explain it, can I just quickly play a short clip from Carrier? Now, for our listeners out there, if you're not wearing headphones, you must put them on before you listen to this, and we'll explain why after you've heard the clip. So here it is.
Are you listening? Good. This is not a podcast. This is not an audiobook. This is a dimensional experience set in the unseen realms to your left, your right, and all that lingers between. We ask that you put on headphones if possible. Use caution during your journey and always listen carefully.
It still gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
So, binaural audio, what is it and how is it created?
Sure. What we refer to as binaural audio was introduced at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And it begins with a stereo recording, which uses a pair of microphones for the left and right channels. We're all familiar with that. But binaural recordings require the microphones to be placed inside some sort of head so they can capture sound the way our own ears do. So when our ears receive sound, our brains process all the subtle differences in volume and quality, and even time delay as the sound reaches each of our inner ears, allowing us to locate not just left and right positions, but in front and behind, above or below, and everything from the shape of our outer ears to the big, dense lump between them factors into that calculation. So with binaural recordings, 2 omnidirectional mics are placed within the ear canals of a dummy head, like a mannequin head, thereby capturing sound exactly the way our own ears would.
Well, what I find amazing, and as I was listening to Carrier, I was actually, for part of it, I was out watching my children ride their bikes up and down the street. Maybe not the best time to be listening to a intense, immersive podcast, but, we've got to do what we've got to do. And at one point, I was absolutely convinced that my garage door behind me was opening or rattling. I kept turning around because I was convinced there was something going on behind me. It's quite freaky how it does that.
It's remarkable, yeah. Dan, so beyond recording binaurally, how did you go about mixing other audio techniques like music and sound effects to heighten the emotional experience for listeners?
Right. Well, the binaural recording was only just one part of this production. So we also recorded with traditional microphones with the actors, and we recorded music and Foley. And then we relied on stock libraries for sound effects that we obviously couldn't create ourselves. The sound design really began with the script and deciding how the story would be told in a project without visuals. We knew the general framework of what audio we would need to produce, and then we began to create a sort of language for this particular story. For example, how important the main character's breathing or tension of gripping a steering wheel could be, or how the sounds rattling around inside her cab would subconsciously reflect her chattering nerves, or how the rhythm of the road could serve as this invisible heartbeat to keep the audience on edge. I had 2 brilliant sound engineers, Jamie Sheffman and Noah Gersh, and they also composed the music. So we decided early on that we would create instruments out of sound effects samples, which allowed us to have this seamless overlap between the sound design and the score.
So cool. And so, Dan, how does going to this extra level of detail to create an immersive soundscape alter the experience for the listener?
Well, I had been very interested in binaural audio and immersive audio because I was doing some conceptual work with Google on their virtual reality projects. And what I found was that audio alone had the power to transport you and make you feel like you were experiencing a story firsthand. So all the things that virtual reality is hoping to do with creating an immersive story, there's all sorts of these issues that are coming up about what kind of VR device is going to catch on with the public, or what's going to be comfortable to wear, or a device that people will be able to take with them. And what I was realizing is with audio, everyone has access to a pair of stereo headphones. And that's really all you need to have the effects work with immersive audio.
You mentioned at Ozpod last year that Carrie was written as a 3-act screenplay, and you wrote the sound design into the script. Can you tell us a bit about the writing process for an immersive podcast?
I had been developing the project as a 3-act feature film, and when I decided to make it an audio series, I had to be very conscious of what I had to work with. So when you look at my scripts, they're formatted like a traditional screenplay, but everything in the script needs to be able to work with audio only. So there's a lot of deliberate descriptions of the character's breath, or her movements in the cab, or the sounds that will clue us into where she is or what she's doing. And when you're working in something like animation or film, the motto is always show, don't tell. But with audio, I'm always trying to find ways to allow sound design to tell a story before relying on the dialogue. That was my approach.
And then when it comes to creating those sounds, what percentage of the soundscape and the effects were captured in the field and using Foley versus in post-production from stock libraries of sound effects later on?
I'm not sure. I would say it's probably about 50-50. We would find it would take just as much time to dig around through those sound libraries to find the right sound or layer together a bunch of sounds to create a new effect. It would take just as much time to go out and record something ourselves that we really liked the specifics of. So my sound designer, Sam Plattner, has a lot of experience as a Foley artist. And we would record anything we could, anything we had access to. And we even convinced a Teamster to drive us around in his semi-truck, and we recorded his engine and the seat buckles and the dashboard switches all in binaural with one of those dummy heads. And I also own a pair of inexpensive binaural microphones that you wear like earbuds, where I'm the dummy head. So I would wear them and perform specific bits of Foley wherever I knew exactly how I wanted the character to act. And most of those were recorded either in my house or in my car.
What was the strangest recording you made?
The There's a lot of me flailing around on the ground to get the right foot scuffle that I wanted, or I can't spoil too much, but there's some creature sound effects that required a lot of trips to the grocery.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I'm trying to piece it together now.
I know,
Okay.
yeah. Can't quite work it out, but there you go. Is there a magic formula between dialogue, sound, music, effects that you do need to strike when developing immersive audio, do you think?
I think they all work in concert, but that's where there's a phase called the mix, and that's really the key in how the story comes across. We spent a lot of focus getting that mix just right, because if a background ambience is too loud or too busy, it really changes the dynamic of a scene and the emotions you're trying to evoke. And also, if there isn't enough space in the pans, the sounds can layer up on each other and become really muddy and unclear. So for this project, I found I was cutting with just dialogue at first, just to kind of get the timing right. And then I would bring in my own temp sound effects and the Foley that I was recording. And then we would do sound design with the sound designer. And the composers were also doing the final mix. So they were able to balance everything at the last minute to get it feeling tonally like something we were all on board with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, the final result is very impressive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's incredible. Yeah. Dan, you're comfortable working on the edge of technology. It's where you shine. So what's next in audio that's exciting you?
I think positional audio is really interesting, and it's sort of the way that games and virtual reality have sound emitting from different locations in a 3D space that you can actually navigate around, especially the way that virtual reality works now, where you're actually able to freely roam around a space. So I think there's tremendous potential in something like that to create immersive stories in a location. There are also these microphones now that can capture 360 degrees of sound at once, even more so than the way that binaural dummy heads record. And Dolby is developing all these new technologies that can bring 5.1 into stereo, and I think they're working on all sorts of other projects to kind of level up what's available as a standard format for these podcasts. But, to me, at the end of the day, it's really about the creative content more than the bells and whistles. So even if it's something that's recorded on a voice memo in mono, if it's good, if the story's good and compelling, then it's interesting. It's exciting to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we definitely agree with that. The story always has to be good, but some of that stuff sounds pretty exciting about where we might end up with audio in the next few years.
No, we're salivating.
Now, it's been a year since Carrier, so that's given you plenty of time to be working on other things. What's coming next from Dan Blank?
Well, right now I'm very busy on the feature adaptation. So, like I said before, we don't know what's to come of it, but so far that will keep me occupied, and hopefully we go into production. But I'm also developing another audio series with Q-Code, and really want to keep pushing further in what I can do and what we can do in this space to try to really elevate the format and find as many different types of stories to tell and really make it its own new field that everybody's excited to be telling stories in.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. I very much look forward to hearing what you come up with Q-Code, and, of course, looking forward to seeing a feature film of Carrier when you're able to get into production. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials. It's been terrific having you.
Thank you, Dan. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
What a fascinating insight into how Dan and the team created Carrier.
Yeah, and I love the fact that he's a sound enthusiast. He's interested in the technology, and as listeners, we get to reap the benefits of his passion and curiosity.
Yeah, and it's great to hear he's still pushing the envelope as well. I can't wait to hear what he comes up with next.
That's it.
What I find really interesting about Dan's story about using immersive audio is that it's not something new. It's amazing that in the 1800s, through the theatrophone, the rich and famous could listen to stereo sounds of orchestras being recorded through hundreds of microphones. That just blows my mind.
Yeah.
And I kind of love the way that in the 1930s and 40s, through that golden age of radio, that those radio dramas, in a way, are being reproduced in a podcast form. And that immersive audio now is adding an extra layer to what's being produced. But what really has changed is the opportunity.
That's exactly right.
Everyone has a pair of headphones. So the ability to listen to this amazing audio is there. Back in the golden era of radio, people were sitting around in their homes listening to a wireless radio with a mono speaker. Whereas now, everyone can listen straight from their phone through headphones.
Yeah.
And really all it means is that the opportunity is there for creators to produce this amazing audio and get it to the masses.
Yeah, well, exactly. And if you look back to when the iPod first came out too, if you remember the ads around that, everyone was wearing the corded earphones, headphones, and it became fashionable all again.
So really, to sum up, we have the technology, we have the audience. We just need audio creators to join the dots and consider what an immersive listening experience can bring to their audience.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, Nick. And it comes back to what Dan was saying about storytelling, because it really does come back to the quality of the story and then enhancing that with smart, incredible sound.
A perfect way to finish, because that is all we have time for on this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
Always a pleasure, Nick. To
find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, perhaps with some immersive audio, you can check out our website at soundcartel.com.au. And we also produce our own daily business podcast, Business Essentials Daily, and we'd love for you to tune in from wherever you're listening right now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.